G'day folks, my name is Rob. Welcome back to another F1 Fantasy video. Today we're looking at my race week preview and final thoughts ahead of the Hungarian Grand Prix this coming weekend. So if you're new around here, be sure to drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. I want to jump straight into a question I've been posed from many of you on YouTube, on Twitter, in relation to how to approach structuring our lineups heading into this race weekend. We're on the back of back-to-back Mercedes victories in Austria and most recently in Silverstone, and there does seem to be a convergence towards not just some, but a lot of Mercedes assets. Now, I think despite the fact Red Bull were quite popular as a constructor choice in Austria for the sprint race and the pit stop points, there probably will be a little bit of divergence away from them in the next few races. Perez's form has certainly dropped off a cliff. His qualifying results is just not anywhere close to where Christian Horner and the team want him to be, and there's also speculation of reports he may not even have a seat on the grid after the summer break. I don't think that's necessarily a whole discussion for right now, but certainly something that should weigh on our minds when considering Red Bull. And as a result of that, McLaren and Mercedes are the two most popular picks in the game. Why do I say that? Because I think when we're looking at our teams, we put the different assets to one side and focus on the variables that are most likely to change week in, week out. I think as of Hungary and certainly Spa and perhaps even beyond the summer break, Mercedes and McLaren, assuming no changes in performance, are probably going to be the two most popular constructor picks for engaged strategists. And that's certainly a lineup I'm running with. So if we put the constructors to one side and other midfield assets in the conversation week in, week out, like the Magnusens, the Gasleys, etc., you're left with 3 or 4 positions in our team, which I would find, for me anyway, rotate every week or every couple of weeks. I think the spot for me, or the couple of spots for me that are most up for debate at the moment, are whether or not I run a Lando Norris and 4 very reliable midfield driver options, which I think is extremely viable to do, or do I converge more towards a Norris Hamilton or a Hamilton Piastri or a Norris Russell for the next couple of weeks, particularly at a circuit like Hungary where there are going to be much fewer overtakes, and perhaps chance my hand on a driver like Logan Sargeant. And I have been, certainly in recent weeks, someone who's spoken up against how having Sargeant in our teams is extremely suboptimal, and I still don't think that changes. But the reason why I think he enters the conversation again is because of the fact that the Sauber drivers, Zhou and Bottas, are just not delivering. They've gone down in price. I think for Bottas, it's 4 out of the last 6 weeks, and Zhou, it's 5 out of the last 6 weeks, which is pretty much on par with Logan Sargeant. Logan Sargeant's at 5.2, below his starting price for the year. And I do think that because Sauber are not really extracting any performance on track or in F1 Fantasy, they are, in my opinion, as I think a couple of other content creators in the community have coined, essentially a more expensive Logan Sargeant. So I think if we're looking at these statistics and these results standalone, Sargeant, Zhou, Bottas are pretty interchangeable for me week in, week out. So I think as a result of that, Sargeant's slightly more affordable price point will enable these premium lineups. In option 1 on the left-hand side, he can, when we're rolling with a budget of somewhere between, for 3 drivers, 54 to 55 million, a Norris Hamilton Sargeant is really not all that much different to a Hamilton Piastri Hulkenberg or a Norris Russell Zhou. These are recency weighted averages taken from F1 Fantasy Tools for the last, I think it's 5 races. So go check out F1 Fantasy Tools if you want to play around with different combinations. But I think to condense it down to 3 different drivers within that $54 to $55 million price bracket, I'm not really seeing all that much disparity between the different lineups I've got on screen. And sure, I think you could certainly change out a Hulkenberg for a Gasly or a Zhou for a Bottas, but I think the differences in points are going to be so minuscule. It'll be a couple of points here or there. And what's that? An overtake, the 1 extra qualifying position if you make it into Q3, for instance. And I'm just not seeing there being an overwhelming argument to say one lineup is necessarily that much better than another. We get to Budapest, and it is, as some people have called it, a Monaco without walls. And I do think that your qualifying result will absolutely dictate for a large part how your fantasy weekend shakes out for those drivers and constructors. And we'll get to F1 Fantasy Tools in a second. But I do think what I'm trying to essentially show you is that I don't think there's necessarily a right or wrong answer if you're looking at 2 premium drivers. The one thing I do like for the Norris lineups is I think even though he hasn't had the best of races the last couple race weekends, McLaren obviously didn't have anything that did any favors for Lando in Silverstone with a win on the plate. But Lando, in my opinion, I still think he is the best driver of the day favorite week in, week out. I think he's got a 60 to 70% chance of winning it every single race weekend. And he is the best qualifier aside from Max Verstappen this season based on his average qualifying result. We get to Hungary, I wouldn't expect anything less than a P3. A P1 to P3 is exactly where I see Lando qualifying. And sure, Max might take pole, but we all know if whoever comes second to Max is going to be the favorite for the driver of the day. And I do think Hamilton and Russell, very good front row lockout in Silverstone. But Lewis, we know from this season, hasn't necessarily been the better qualifier of the two. So even though he had a lot of fans banging on for him to get driver of the day, I do think Lando's superior qualifying performance in a car that I think is objectively stronger than the Silver Arrows makes me lean towards option 1 or 3. But it is very marginal. I wouldn't say it's objectively better or worse, but I do think option 2 means you're able to go for a slightly less risky option in the Saubers and Logan Sargent. So I think something to play with. Wait until we get to free practice as always, but I do think it makes for a very clear case that there isn't an obvious right or wrong answer looking at our lineups week in, week out. Something else I want to look at is overtakes. I touched on it before, and I wanted to bring up this incredibly great graphic from Adam at F1 Fantasy HQ. It's actually probably one of, if not my favorite graphics he's produced this season. So really good visual to understand where we can really maximize the points for overtakes each weekend. And so Hungary, as I mentioned before, one of the slowest circuits on the calendar, probably second only to Monaco. And even though it was seventh for all overtakes in 2022, it still wasn't a high number. And I think what makes the 51 look markedly smaller in 2023 was because we had 7 races that had overtakes of more than 100, where we didn't have a single one of those the year prior. So when you look at overtakes at this circuit in a vacuum, you're averaging 2.5 to 3 overtakes per race per driver over the last couple of years. And I don't think that necessarily gives much weight to drivers like Kevin Magnussen, for example, who we know will typically not do that well in qualifying, but in that Haas, better race pace than it has had the last couple seasons. He is the overtake merchant of 2024, in my opinion. So K-Mag is a magnet for those. Are we going to see quite as many at the Hungaroring? I wouldn't say as many. There probably will still be some, but I don't think we're going to see too many drivers with more than 4 or 5 overtakes on the Sunday. So just something to think about. Maybe target better qualifiers. And for me, if we're looking in the C-tier asset class, Nico Hülkenberg a cut above the rest. The best qualifier. He's in a rich vein of form, back-to-back P6s. So he is my pick of the bunch for the C-tier assets. And we're going to get into the driver tier list in a second. But I do think that you want to target in the B tier, in the C tier, those better qualifiers. So in the A tier, it's Lando Norris, Max Verstappen, but I don't think many of us are running Max at this point. So Lando, very good in that sense. Looking at the B tier, I think I got to tip my hat to George Russell. He's had the wood on Lewis Hamilton this season. And I do think the McLaren's going to be strong around here. Again, they were good here last year. And I do think Oscar Piastri, I've said it for probably 4 or 5 weeks in a row now, he's bound to get that breakthrough win. I think he's probably on my list as the last driver to crack a win this season for a driver that hasn't already had one in his career. So I think that's certainly on the horizon if McLaren can get their strategy together. But I do think it is quite telling, this graph, in terms of where we're going to see the points shake out. And I think as we saw in 2023, the top 7, top 8 drivers were all from the top 4 teams. We didn't really see any drivers in the C tier crack more than 10 points. So I think it is quite telling that unless we see someone like a Hülkenberg qualifying Q3, have another good quality result, it'll probably be a pretty quiet week for points across the board. So just something to keep in mind. Target those better qualifiers and hope they can just hold position at a track that typically is quite difficult to maximize overtakes at. In terms of driver power rankings, I actually love this section because it gives you guys an opportunity to see where my head is at in terms of where I rank each of them, and I can talk a little bit about some of them that are on my radar. Lewis Hamilton, great win in Silverstone. I am a huge fan of Mercedes as an F1 fantasy asset, and Lewis Hamilton certainly, although I would say it's close margins between him and Piastri, certainly has the momentum heading into Hungary. And people are saying Mercedes might fall back a little bit in Hungary. That's certainly possible, but I do think they're still an easy top 3 team. Ferrari, I know, have struggled a little bit, and there is reports that they may well just revert to the specification they had for their car that was earlier in the season, but that's probably at least another race or two away before they can fix that. So I'm liking Mercedes. I'm liking Lewis Hamilton's stock. He's on the rise. I think the order is in the B tier for me is pretty much unchanged, though. Stroll enters the B tier as we know at 15.1. Absolute sell, in my opinion, if you own him. There's really no value there at all. Moving into the C tier, Hülkenberg, absolute buy if you don't already own him. For Budapest, I already own him. He could be a season-long hold for me at this point in time, given how often his price is going up. K-Mag, yes, I said before, not as good a qualifier, may struggle for additional overtakes. But Zach F1, another F1 content creator, did point out that K-Mag just seems to unearth fantasy points even when we least expect it. And I do think K-Mag's just going to be another one of those drivers that even if he is qualifying P14 to P17, he'll just somehow pick up overtakes here and there. He's an experienced driver in a car that seems to be much more improved even compared to the start of the season. So I do think K-Mag, absolute lock for me most likely this weekend, unless I diverge into a Logan Sargent type team. Speaking of Logan Sargent, stock is, I wouldn't say soaring, but it's certainly going above the Saubers. As I pointed out before, his price point, 2.5 million less than Bottas and Zhou, a great budget enabler. Sure, I don't think he's scoring more than 5 points each week. Season high of 9 and has dropped like a stone in price. So you kind of have to bite the bullet if you're getting him in to enable a Hamilton, Russell, or Piastri or double B tier lineup. Just accept his price is going to go down 0.1, 0.2 million. But I hope the points that you're going to extract from the Mercedes and McLaren drivers will more than make up for that. So definitely someone who I think is just a more affordable Sauber driver. And Zhou Bottas, I've got Zhou. I mean, he's the worst qualifier in F1 this season. He's qualified P20, I think, 5 or 6 times, even worse than Sargent. So I think I'm leaning on Zhou as I have the last few weeks for just positions gained, and hope the attrition for drivers ahead will make him naturally make up points, but I'm just not seeing that enough at the moment. There's no performance in that car and just not really any fantasy value at 7.7 or so million. So someone I've got one eye on to sell, unless of course I go, as I said before, with a Russell Sargent type lineup. Quickly on the weather, it is going to be pretty hot across the board. I mean, I'm suffering from a bit of a heat wave here in New York City, but Budapest is going to be pretty much exactly like that too. No chance of rain most likely, and unless we do see some precipitation come through on Saturday, which I still think is going to be unlikely, we might see the odd sun shower or something like that. Probably a risk-free weekend for the most part. So maybe that is a chance for someone like Logan Sargent to take a punt on. It is a slow circuit, so maybe a good thing for him. Less chance of going off track. Not exactly narrow like Monaco. So could be a boring weekend, but I've said that for probably 6 weeks in a row now, and it's been anything but that heading into the deadline. On tip and team, I think I mean team and chip strategy. I said about Norris, best DRS boost option still, I think. Close to a 10-point head start. If not that, then I think Hamilton, Piastri, you're pulling teeth as to who's better over the two. I think, there's probably a case to be made for going for either Lewis or Oscar as differential options. There are going to be very few people that do run either driver as their 2x DRS boost, unless you're going for a lineup sans Lando Norris. But I think Lando just makes it a very easy 2x choice. Whereas even though, there's a very possible outcome where Lando is outscored by Lewis or Oscar, I still think the probability of Lando scoring more than both of them is more than likely. So I feel like I have a bit more comfort knowing having Lando in my team is enough to at least auto lock that 2x on him. For chip strategy, a lot of positive feedback around having just my thoughts on whether or not there's a right or a wrong weekend for each of these chips. Hungary, I would say probably not. Now, I think if you're going a Hamilton Piastri, you're not sure which driver is going to score more, then throw the autopilot on. I use it in Canada effectively with Lewis and Leclerc in the wet weather as well. But I do think, if it's not obvious who you think is going to be the better scorer, slap it on. I don't think it's a weekend for the 3X. I don't think it's really a weekend for the no negative. And wildcard final fix are very much team dependent. For Limitless, I'm going to give another shout out to another F1 Fantasy content creator, Rain Fantasy. He was talking about the Limitless very recently in one of his videos as to whether or not it's viable at Budapest. Now, it very much depends on the order of the teams qualifying and performing to very much align with who you pick. And I do think it is going to be another race weekend at Budapest where the top 4 teams are going to hold the top 8 spots on the grid. And if we do see something like that where you can absolutely nail those top 5 drivers and top 2 constructors, it will set you apart. I'd still, for me, I think if we want to get technical about overtakes here and positions gained there, then you can make it a very compelling argument for the Limitless chip on a non-sprint weekend. I've already used mine in Miami. I still like the sprint weekends. It's a much easier decision for a Limitless team where there are more points on the table. But if you want to consider a differential weekend, then Budapest could be that weekend if you can pick the top 5 drivers and constructors correctly. Now, I don't know if it's obvious to me. I think in terms of drivers, if there's anyone watching this that is entertaining it, it's Verstappen, Norris, Hamilton, Piastri probably for me, and then probably George Russell. So I think McLaren, Mercedes are almost certainly locks for me. The only reason I wouldn't go Red Bull constructor is just because Perez's qualifying woes. You don't want a driver like Checo going out before Q3 at a track where there are so few overtakes. So despite the fact that it is a circuit where there's at least 2 stops, 2-stopper, even maybe a 3-stopper for some teams, where there are more pit stop points on the table for Red Bull, you just don't also want to run the risk where Perez goes out in Q1, in Q2, and I just don't see him making it up the field like he did 12 months prior. The cars ahead of him are much more competitive than they were a year ago, so I just don't know if Checo's worth the risk. And the Red Bull constructor, for me, probably isn't my cup of tea. But if you're a risk taker and you want a differential, this is the weekend for Limitless. So in terms of how my team is looking, team selection, broke it down a little bit. I've got a couple of different options on the table and 6.1 million in the bank. One of the obvious choices for me would be a George Russell and Logan Sargent lineup. I think I can just afford that on the back of George dropping $500,000 in price in Silverstone. I don't think he's going to have another rotten weekend like that. I think he's a good qualifier, as I talked about, and he'll probably be definitely top 5 in my opinion if recent form is to be believed. You've got 2 terrible qualifiers, the 2 worst in the game. So I don't know if I love like an auto price drop in both of these. That's why I'm a little bit mixed about that. But that is one such option I could think about. There is another option of potentially just using one trade and rolling another into Spa where Max has that potential grid penalty. Now, this is one such option I could do, is just go Max Verstappen for Hungary. Best qualifier this season and super off the beaten track, I think, for me in terms of strategy. The thing is, though, I need to be certain that grid penalty in Spa is being taken before the Hungarian deadline. Otherwise, I could have a bit of egg on my face come Spa if he doesn't actually follow through with that. So I don't know if it's a risk I'm willing to take just yet. But if there is a report or two that suggests or confirms Max will be taking grid penalty in Belgium a week later, I could potentially go with this. Yeah, he won here last year and was the highest scoring driver in F1 Fantasy last year. So good recent form. I'm sure he's looking to bounce back after not quite winning in Silverstone last week. So that's another option for me. Stick Lando back in there. 6.1. The other alternative could just be to go for, actually I'd probably keep K-Mag if I'm being honest, and probably bin off Gasly, just because of the fact that your K-Mag just somehow manages to unearth points from every orifice on his body. He is an absolute magnet for points this season. I could probably go for, I don't know, there's plenty of options on the table. Could go for I mean, Ocon, even though I had Gasly, that's still like 3 million there. So one such option could be upgrade Ocon. There's just no one else really. Alonso, I've seen very little from him to suggest it's worth taking a punt on him this year. So I'm certainly undecided. I know with absolute certainty, Hulkenberg, Mercedes, and McLaren are more likely than not staying in my team for this weekend. Probably will stay with Lando for another week, so it could well be a roll one transfer or pivot into a George and Logan Sargent lineup. A lot to dissect, and I think practice times are going to be extremely critical as well. So keep an eye on those heading into the deadline. Speaking of, Adam from F1 Fantasy HQ and I will be back for another deadline stream an hour before qualifying this Saturday. So jump into the stream if you want to have any of your questions answered. Details to FanAmp's channel and the stream will be in the description below. So check that out if you haven't done so already. But I'm going to leave it there for now, guys. As always, appreciate the love and support. Good luck with your teams this weekend, and I'll see you all very soon.